What if God really is dead? Not metaphorically, not as a cultural symbol, but as the foundation on which civilization has rested for centuries. What if there is no longer a higher purpose, no absolute truth, no universal meaning? What remains for man except the horror of the freedom bestowed upon him? Friedrich Nietzsche was the one who first gazed into this void and did not look away. His philosophy is not a collection of clever phrases, it is an existential act, an attempt to live in a world without supports. His style is not cold academicism, but a pulsating text, written on the edge of pain and revelation. He spoke to those who could no longer live as is customary. In this video, not just a biography, but a reconstruction, an immersion, a script for those who feel that everything has collapsed but want to understand how to live further. The 19th century was a time of unprecedented change for Europe. The old feudal order crumbled under the weight of industrialization and bourgeois modernization. Germany, long a mosaic conglomerate of small principalities and kingdoms, united in 1871 into the German Empire under the rule of Prussia and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. This political unification was accompanied by aggressive militarization, a rise in national consciousness, and at the same time, the alienation of the individual in a bureaucratic society. The Industrial Revolution transformed the social fabric. Manufactory gave way to the factory. Labor ceased to be a craft and became part of a mechanism. Peasants flocked to the cities, and with this began the process of alienation of man from nature and from himself. The gap between the internal and the external, between the I and the world, became particularly palpable. The intellectual climate also underwent radical shifts. Scientific rationalism began to displace religious worldviews. In 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, questioning the biblical account of creation. And Karl Marx, in Capital, exposed the structure of exploitation and placed economics at the center of history, not morality. Kant had long before delineated the boundaries of cognition, and Schopenhauer gave Europe the language of suffering and will as the groundless energy of life. Religious faith no longer held its former weight. People continued to go to church as if by inertia, but their inner world was splitting between ritual and doubt. A cultural fissure appeared into which Nietzsche would soon burst. He emerged at the moment when the Europeans still remembered the commandments but already felt their emptiness, when God was still formally present but no longer intervened, when man still called himself a Christian but lived as an atheist. It is in this void, in this transitional space, that the voice is born, which would later say, "God is dead, we have killed him." Nietzsche would not become a philosopher of consolation, he would be a prophet of rupture. His thinking is not a system but a convulsion, not a construction but an explosion. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the Prussian village of Rücken, into the family of a hereditary Lutheran pastor, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche. It was a deeply religious Protestant environment where faith was considered not only a matter of the soul, but also the foundation of social order. His father served at the court of the Saxon Duke, which gave the family status. Friedrich himself was perceived from childhood as the heir to a spiritual tradition, a sensitive, thoughtful, and quiet boy. But the early death of his father in 1849 from illness upended the child's world. 2 years later, his younger brother Joseph also died. These tragedies were not just blows, but the structure of Nietzsche's future worldview. From an early age, he found himself face to face with finitude, with helplessness, with a silent God. He grew up in an almost female monastery, his mother, grandmother, and 2 aunts, a world of strictness and silence. There was little conversation, but much observation. Nietzsche early on showed an inclination for music and literature. He was called the Little Pastor for his seriousness and conscientiousness. He excelled in his studies, but even in his youth he began to doubt dogmas and their divine infallibility. At the age of 14, he enrolled in the prestigious gymnasium in Naumburg, then studied at the Forta School, known for its strict classical discipline. It was there that he became acquainted with Greek poetry and tragedy, ancient philosophy, and began keeping personal diaries in which he explored themes of suffering, fate, and eternity. At the University of Bonn, he started with theology and classical philology, but quickly became disillusioned with theology. Later, he transferred to Leipzig, where he encountered the works of Schopenhauer, books that, in his words, made him think alone. Schopenhauer was not just a philosopher, he was the first resonance for Nietzsche, where suffering is the foundation of being. At the age of 24, Friedrich became the youngest professor of classical philology in the history of the University of Basel. But a career was not his goal. Even then, Nietzsche suffered from migraines, eye problems, and internal crises. He was drawn not to academic life, but to ultimate expression. He wanted not to explain, but to awaken, to stir, to destroy, and to shape. After his first years of teaching in Basel, Nietzsche increasingly felt an inner discord. His health mirrored his philosophy, unstable, tense, prone to attacks. His diaries became denser, his style more agitated. He realized that being just a professor was not his path. Thought demanded risk. It was at this moment in 1872 that he published his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. This was a very strange book, unlike academic treatises. It was written at the intersection of philosophy, aesthetics, mythology, and music. In it, Nietzsche sought to explain why ancient Greek tragedy disappeared and why it mattered. He contrasted two forces, the Apollonian, clear, rational, formative, and the Dionysian, dark, ecstatic, dissolving. According to Nietzsche, great tragedy arose only when these forces were in balance. Without Dionysus, life would be unbearable. Without Apollo, incomprehensible. But modern culture, he argued, suppressed Dionysus, deified form, fled from passion, replaced music with logic, myth with science, and pain with comfort, thereby killing life itself. The book was a failure. Academics rejected it outright. Even his close friend Wagner, to whom it was dedicated, soon distanced himself. But Nietzsche had already taken a step aside, a step into the void. His health deteriorated. He left the university, withdrew from academia, and began his solitary wandering through Switzerland, Italy, and France, with a notebook in his pocket and pain in his head. He lived as a philosopher exile and wrote as a man for whom philosophy was all that remained. In 1878, the book Human, All Too Human was published, and it was entirely different, strict, dry, cut into aphorisms. In it, a surgery of thought. No poetry, no myths, only a scalpel. He dissected morality, religion, and love like a biologist or an anatomist. Truth is an army of metaphors that have become forgotten. He showed morality not as a reflection of divine will, but merely as a social construct. Its purpose not truth, but control. The weak use it to survive in a world of the strong. This was no longer Nietzsche the humanist. This was Nietzsche the critic, Nietzsche the destroyer. But behind every blow was the despair of a seeker. He sought, he destroyed to clear a space for what? He didn't yet know for what, but he kept going further. The early 1880s. Nietzsche was alone. He was not tied to universities, had no family, no stable health, no students. But he had a clear sense that he was writing not about philosophy, but about the very fate of Europe. And in this solitude, in this wandering through the South, he created one of his most piercing books, The Gay Science. The title is paradoxical because there is no gaiety in the conventional sense in the book. It speaks of joy as the courage to look into the abyss and not recoil. This book is like fragments, like sparks, aphorisms, miniatures, short blows to the familiar. It is here that the phrase that would become central to all 20th century philosophy first appears: God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This is not just a declaration of atheism, it is a cultural shock, a proclamation of the collapse of the entire metaphysical structure on which Europe rested. Christian morality, the idea of progress, the purpose of history, heavenly judgment, all dead. But Nietzsche does not point fingers. He does not blame. He says, We killed God. We, the people of modernity, enlightened, confident in reason, we destroyed what made our world stable. Do we not feel that the whole earth has detached from the sun? Are we not falling deeper and deeper into the void? This is the horror of freedom, when there are no longer frames, no guarantees, no meaning except what you create yourself. Humanity found itself in open space, but Nietzsche does not propose mourning this. He sees in it a chance, a purification, a space in which not a new God but a new man can be born. Here in The Gay Science, he first hints at an image that will soon become central to his philosophy, the Übermensch, superhuman. Man is a rope stretched between animal and superhuman. Meaning is no longer given from without. It must be invented. To live no longer means to obey, but to create. Everyone becomes an artist of their own life. Responsibility becomes absolute and terrifying. The Gay Science is not a book about joy. It is a book about courage, about the necessity of dancing on the edge of the abyss. 1883. Nietzsche wrote in solitude between alpine villages, in wanderings filled with headaches, loneliness, and an almost mystical sense of mission. He was not merely composing a philosophical treatise. He was creating a revelation. His voice changed. His style was like a storm cloud. Thus was born his main work. Thus spoke Zarathustra. This is not a book. It is a hymn. It is a prophecy. It is philosophy written as poetry, as a myth of a new world. The main character is Zarathustra. His name is not accidental. It is the ancient Persian prophet, the founder of Zoroastrianism. But in Nietzsche, he is the image of a new man who descended from the mountains to say, man is not the goal. He is a transition, a bridge. I teach you the superhuman, man must be overcome. Zarathustra addresses people, but they do not hear him. His ideas are too unfamiliar. He says the following, you live as if you have reached the pinnacle, but in reality you are merely an intermediate form between animal and what man can become. The superhuman is not a mutant, not a superhero, not a political leader, not a chosen one. It is everyone who has managed to renounce others' truths, who has understood that there is no meaning but has not given up, who takes on the titanic task of creating meaning as an artist creates a canvas. The superhuman is a man who is his own God, not in pomp, but in responsibility. Creating, redeeming. Everything new, everything hopeful must be born in pain, but most people do not want this path. They prefer the last man, cozy, small, moderate. He does not suffer and does not hope. He lives as is customary. He does not seek truth. He wants comfort. The last man blinks. He says, I invented happiness, and winks. The superhuman and the last man are two future paths. One is difficult, terrifying, heroic. The other is easy but empty. Nietzsche shows the choice is not for the prophet. The choice is for each of us. It is in Zarathustra that one of Nietzsche's most enigmatic and powerful ideas appears, eternal recurrence. Imagine, he says, that a demon one day tells you, you will live your life again and again. Exactly the same. Every pain, every mistake, every evening, again, endlessly, millions of times. If you can say yes to this thought, if you can embrace your fate as it is, you are living correctly. The will that says, thus I would want again, that is what I call love of fate. This is not metaphysics. It is ethics, a test, a diagnosis, if you will. Do you live as you would want to live again, or as you want to forget? Thus spoke. Zarathustra is not a book of answers. It is a book of challenge. It does not lead you by the hand. It places you on the edge and asks, who are you? By the mid-1880s, Nietzsche completely broke with the humanistic conception. His style became increasingly sharp and ruthless. He no longer tried to negotiate with culture. He entered into open conflict. During this time, he wrote several key works: Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, The Antichrist, 1888. This is his late mature philosophy, without embellishment or compromise. Here, Nietzsche rethinks the very idea of morality. He asks, where do our values come from? Who decided that good is mercy, humility, and submission? Why is suffering considered a path to purification? He concludes, modern morality is not truth but a product of historical struggle, specifically between the strong and the weak. Strong peoples, according to Nietzsche, originally created their morality based on strength and pride. This is what he calls aristocratic morality. In it, good is the powerful, courageous, and creative. But then he says a reversal occurred. The weak, that is, the oppressed, the humiliated, the envious, created their own morality and called it Christian. In it, good is humility, submission, and forgiveness. Evil is strength, will, and pride. Thus arose the slave morality, a way of surviving in a world where you have no power. Nietzsche does not merely criticize Christianity as a religion, he sees in it a symbol of all European morality, a morality that, in his view, denies life itself. Against this, he proposes the idea of the will to power. This is not politics or tyranny. It is not power over others. It is the energy of becoming, the inner impulse of life to change, to overcome, to move forward. Everything living, according to Nietzsche, lives through the will to power. Even a plant strives toward the light. Even a thought wants to dominate. The will to power is the courage to act without explanation, to create without permission, to love life even if it is pure pain. It is the antithesis of submission, self-pity, and moral whining. These ideas were so radical that even his closest admirers in the future would fear them. His sister, after his collapse, published a collection titled The Will to Power, which he himself never completed, and later attempts were made to turn it into an ideology of totalitarianism. But for Nietzsche, this was not about domination. It was about life in its ultimate honesty, without illusions, without guilt, without fear. He spoke of cruelty, but first of all, toward himself. From the world, he demanded truth, and from himself, the impossible. And behind all this philosophical intensity was a man. Not a superhuman, not a prophet, but a man living in pain, deeply strange and lonely, not fully understood even by those who were close to him. Music was his first passion, Wagner, his idol and friend, and later a spiritual adversary. Nietzsche himself played the piano, composing romantic pieces. He often said that philosophy begins where music runs out of words. He was not a thinker in an office. True thoughts came to him in motion. He wandered alone for hours along Swiss trails among rocks and pines. It was there, at altitude among the clouds, that he dictated to himself the lines of Zarathustra. Nietzsche believed, philosophy is born in movement, in steps, in breath, in the rhythm of the body, not in dry logic. He lived modestly, almost ascetically, in boarding houses or rented rooms, with a minimum of possessions. Breakfast, milk and bread, sometimes eggs. He loved simple food, couldn't stand extravagance. Light caused him pain, so he often wrote lying down in semi-darkness. His body was fragile, as if it couldn't keep up with what was happening in his mind. He suffered from migraines, stomach pain, and constant weakness, and yet he continued to work. Sometimes Nietzsche wrote about his suffering in letters, but more often about the weather, the sun, the smell of pine forests after rain. His correspondence is not only thoughts, it is fragments of being, ink, sleep, the wind outside the window. In life he was reserved but not detached. He had close relationships, albeit short-lived. One of them was Paul Ray, a philosopher and friend with whom they shared long conversations. Later, Peter Gast, whom Nietzsche trusted as a writer and editor. He dictated much to him when he could no longer write himself, but almost all relationships ended in a break. He couldn't be convenient. He didn't ask for support. He demanded truth. And that was exhausting. He wrote, "I don't need people. I need those who can endure my solitude." And then one day, a person appeared who, for a time, broke through his armor. Lou Salome, free, intelligent, bold. He fell in love. He proposed and was rejected, not because she didn't understand, but because he was too heavy. They remained acquaintances. In one photograph, she stands with a whip, Nietzsche beside her, theatrically, symbolically, painfully. Later, he would say, "She played the role of the most decisive being in my life." In his life, there was no family, no children, no money, no peace. But there was one thing, a fire that he did not let be extinguished, neither by his body nor by pain nor by loneliness. Everything before 1889 was an ascent, lonely, painful, but continuous. He lost friends, health, recognition, but thought, work, and text remained. He could suffer, but he could write, and that held him together. In January 1889, in Turin, the city where he was then living, something snapped. According to legend, he went out onto the street and saw a coachman with a whip beating a stubborn horse. Nietzsche rushed to the animal, embraced it, and burst into tears. He shouted something, indistinctly, desperately. After that, silence. He ceased to be himself. What began afterward can hardly be called psychosis. He stopped writing. His speech became incoherent. He sent letters to friends and acquaintances signed as Dionysus, Emperor, the Crucified, Godfather of Humanity. Sometimes all at once. Doctors diagnosed progressive paralysis, possibly syphilitic brain damage. But today, there are many theories. Hereditary disease, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, intoxication. No one knows for sure. And perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that thought stopped flowing. His mind, which just yesterday produced the most powerful texts in European philosophy, faded like the sun in fog. He lived another 11 years, completely dependent on his mother, later on his sister. He no longer wrote, no longer spoke. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he sang, sometimes he stared into the void, but he was gone. This is not just a personal tragedy, it is a dramatic image of a philosopher who reached the limit of thought and did not return, a man who all his life spared himself nothing, allowed himself no lies, and did not hide behind hope, and one day found himself without skin before a world where there is no longer God, no meaning, no structure. This can be read as a clinical case, or as a terrifying allegory. What happens when a person thinks too deeply, when he not only destroys myths but remains in a vacuum alone? After all the words Nietzsche spoke, who is ready to truly hear him? Who will not just quote him but enter into dialogue? Who will not fear the death of God, the will to power, or the void? One of the few was Martin Heidegger, a 20th century philosopher, author of the radical work Being and Time. A thinker not of morality, not of ideology, but of existence itself. He was not just a reader of Nietzsche, he was his interlocutor across a generation, across silence, across the abyss. Let us not forget Heidegger's dark side. In 1933, he was a rector, supported the Nazis, and later withdrew into silence. This cannot be ignored, but here we are, speaking of philosophy, not biography, of what he heard in Nietzsche, and what we do with it, judge or understand, is up to each of us. Heidegger dedicated 4 lecture courses to Nietzsche, over 1,000 pages of text. He read him as a symptom, as a cry, as a turning point. In his words, Nietzsche is the last metaphysician of the West, but in his voice, a rupture already sounds. His hammer is the bell of the end. Heidegger saw that Nietzsche did not merely reject old morality. He brought to its limit the very Western idea of truth, meaning, and order. And in this lies the strength, but also the danger. When Nietzsche spoke of the will to power, Heidegger heard more than just a philosophy of strength. He heard a formula of being. According to Nietzsche, everything that exists wants to assert itself. Everything living wants to be more. Even thought wants to prevail. Even culture wants domination. To be means to dominate. But Heidegger asks, what if this thinking is precisely the cause of our civilizational blindness? What if the will to power is not liberation, but a trap? We turn everything into a resource. Everything becomes a tool, even man. Thus, Heidegger opens a new horizon, beyond the will. He says that after the death of God comes not the void of despair, but the silence of being. To hear it, one must stop, be silent. He calls this state, pardon my German, Seinsverlassenheit, abandonment by being. The void is not absence, it is waiting. It is a place where a different thinking can be born. Heidegger writes from his mountain hut in the Black Forest, between firewood and snow, between labor and silence. He seeks not an answer, but a connection. His philosophy is an experience, like Nietzsche's, only instead of an explosion, silence. He does not want to save Nietzsche. He wants to understand why did he go to the end, and how can we live on after him. Thus begins philosophy, after truth, after system, after metaphysics. But with the same question, what does it mean to be? When it seems that everything about Nietzsche is clear, Karl Jaspers appears, an existentialist philosopher, psychiatrist, and subtle interpreter of human depth. He did not merely study Nietzsche, he listened to his contradictions, and noticed what hides behind the loud phrases, behind the rebellion, behind the curses against Christianity. Those who read Nietzsche superficially will see hatred in him. Those who read deeply will hear loss. Nietzsche indeed attacks Christianity. He calls it the religion of the weak, the instinct of revenge, the denial of life. He writes, Christianity is a conspiracy of the resentful against everything noble. He speaks harshly, mercilessly, but there is another side. In letters to friends, he admits that it was in Christianity that he first felt the depth of meaning, that Christ as a figure was, in its own way, perfect, that this was the only piece of ideal life he believed in as a child. According to Jaspers, a split occurs in Nietzsche between the prophet of Dionysus, pagan excess, passion, pain, and the lost disciple of Christ, yearning for higher meaning but no longer able to believe. His will to power is not a philosophy of strength. It is an attempt to survive in a world where God is silent. The superhuman is not an alternative to man. It is a suffering God in a new form, an attempt to create a figure that can bear what was once held only by faith. Nietzsche destroys Christianity in the way only someone shaped by it can destroy. This is not militant atheism, it is an existential loss and a cry, not against God, but from the impossibility of believing as before, the cry of a man who was inside and left. Jaspers shows, to understand Nietzsche, one must feel this ambivalence. His philosophy is not a rejection of meaning, it is a thirst for meaning pushed to the limit, and this makes him close to everyone who has ever stood before the abyss. After Nietzsche's collapse, his body belonged to doctors, and his mind became a trophy. His sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, a woman with nationalist views and ambitions, took on the mission of preserving her brother's legacy. But she did not merely edit, she rewrote. From clippings, notes, and drafts, she compiled the book The Will to Power, which he himself never completed and perhaps never intended to publish. In this new Nietzsche, more power, less irony, more slogans, fewer doubts. His ideas were torn from context, polished, and presented as a philosophy of strength for the masses. In the 1930s, the Nazis began using his name as a philosophical prop for their ideology. His bust stood in Hitler's house. The words "will to power" echoed in speeches. But this was not Nietzsche. It was a shadow, tailored to fit an ideology. In reality, Nietzsche despised anti-Semitism, German nationalism, and mass politics as such. He broke with Wagner precisely because of his nationalist hysteria. Nietzsche wrote, "Every anti-Semite is a scoundrel." Only after World War II did Nietzsche's second birth begin. His ideas were read again as he wrote them, not as a slogan, but as a challenge. Albert Camus called Nietzsche the father of modern absurdity. Jean-Paul Sartre saw in him the foundation of existentialism. Michel Foucault, the beginning of the critique of power as discourse. Jung, the progenitor of archetypal depth. Gilles Deleuze saw in him the first post-structuralist. Today, Nietzsche is not just a philosopher, he is a cultural code. He influences everything, from cinema to architecture, from fashion theory to psychoanalysis. In Naumburg, where he spent his youth, the Nietzsche House has been opened, a museum, library, and archive. Conferences, exhibitions, and lectures are held there. In Basel, where he taught, the philosophy department bears his name. And in Switzerland, you can walk his roots through the mountains where he wrote Zarathustra. In universities, he is studied in courses on ethics, psychology, cultural studies, and even marketing as a researcher of will, image, and influence. His phrases are on t-shirts and album covers, his style is in design, his doubts are in Generation Z. The paradox of Nietzsche is that he wanted to be heard in the future. And he was. He wrote that he was not born for his time, but for the day after tomorrow. And indeed, with each decade, he sounds more and more accurate. Because Nietzsche is not a ready-made answer. It is a philosophy for growing up. For those who want to become themselves, even if they don't know who they are. Nietzsche offers no consolation. He does not offer salvation. He does not persuade. He pushes out. There is no God. There is no meaning. You are alone, and you are free, radical, dangerous, painful. Become who you are. That's not a motivational quote. It's a challenge. It's a judgment. It's a chance. You can be the last person, calm, cozy, content, or you can take a risk, embrace the chaos, and build something new out of it, something alive. Are you ready?